Now, when they looked at skydivers who did this a lot, here's what they found. This would be, 100th time skydiving. You can see that the reaction was really different. So instead of having that really big fear response or terror response, they didn't have very much of that. Always a little apprehensiveness, always a little nervousness because you are doing something that is potentially dangerous. But then once they're on the ground, whoa, this very big positive reaction that, as you can remember how it was earlier, gets much larger. So with time, this opposite reaction, the joy and relief, get much larger. So we see with this model two things about emotions. One is that emotions occur sort of with these opposite pairs, where you get one emotion first and then it'll be followed by an opposite emotion afterwards. And then we also see that with repeated experiences, it's the opposite emotion that gets larger. Now let's take a look at the underlying theoretical processes that help explain how we get these opposite reactions and how it is that we start experiencing the opposite or the secondary process more strongly with repeated experiences. So we're going to start off by looking at the very first skydive that took place to give us kind of our starting point. And what we're going to look at is how the experience of skydiving internally produces two separate types of reactions within us, so that our emotions are often the result of competing feelings and competing emotional processes. And so we saw that what the person feels primarily on the first skydive is a large amount of terror, followed by some joy and relief once they actually land on the ground and the event ends. So as we saw, the A process is triggered directly by the stimulus. In this case, it's triggered directly by skydiving. When the person jumps out of an airplane for the first time, it immediately triggers this significantly large experience that we can just think of as being sort of the A process, which remember is terror. And but that's not the only thing that's triggered, because again, these emotions are being produced together. So the opposite emotion, the B, gets triggered as well. It's just not as strong at this point. And so once we feel this extreme terror, this opposite emotion will gradually kick in, and it gradually tapers off once we've landed on the ground. And so we can see here that in red, I have the underlying B process. And we're going to say that equals sort of relief and terror. Sorry, relief and joy. And so we have these two opposite experiences. What do we feel? Well, A minus B. The amount of terror minus the amount of relief and joy. And so what we actually experience might be something somewhat like this. Where once again, once we are on the ground, we feel extreme joy. Once we're done and we're back on the ground. Now let's take a look and see how the situation has changed after lots of experience skydiving. And we're now going to just take a look at the hypothetical 100th time that this individual has been skydiving. Now, when they jump out, we can take a look at these underlying sort of theoretical processes that are going on, these opposite reactions. And so the A process kicks in and is just as strong as ever. Because remember, A process is triggered by the skydiving, it's triggered by the stimulus. It doesn't change over time. What has changed is that the B process that is triggered by the A, so all of that terror of skydiving doesn't feel comfortable, so we produce an opposite reaction to restore a certain amount of homeostasis or sort of balance in how we're feeling. That opponent process, that secondary process, which we know of as joy or relief, is the one that gets bigger and bigger the more times the person jumps out of a plane. So the greater the number of experiences with this event, the stronger and the bigger the B process, the opposite process, gets. And so I'm going to draw that right now. You can see that got much bigger. Well, what do we feel? Once again, we feel the A minus the B. And now, because the B has grown so much bigger, now B cannot get larger than the A, but it can get just about as large as the A, and that's kind of what I've tried to draw here. So the B is sort of, just about as big as the A, and that works as the whole time that we're in the air. But once we land, once the stimulus is over, so the A process, that theoretical A process that involves the terror and the fear of being in the air, gets turned on really fast when we jump out of the plane, and it gets turned off really fast once we land. But the B process lingers, and so what we feel once we land on the ground is really just the B process, that secondary opposite reaction. Because again, what we feel is always going to be A minus B, the terror minus the joy. That leads us to feel quite a bit of joy at this point. And if you compare the amount of joy now after 100 skydives versus the first time, it's actually gotten bigger. So the more we do something, the bigger the opposite reaction will get. Part of this we can explain by thinking about how the B process is there to stop us from being sort of swayed too much in one direction, sort of to help mellow out our emotional experiences. And so once we know we're going to repeat something over and over and over again that has a very strong emotional reaction on us, the B process gets bigger and it kind of keeps us more even. And that's what we're seeing here in the yellow, where our reaction is much more mellow after 100 skydives than on the first one, because that B process has gotten so much bigger. And so it's really a way of our nervous system sort of keeping us in check, keeping us mellow, keeping us from having very big emotional swings, especially when we know that we're going to experience something repeatedly. Now let's take a look at another example that has a different set of emotions. And so let's think about the feeling of love, perhaps. And we're going to imagine that this is a person's feelings very early in the relationship. First kiss, second kiss, like that. So you might imagine that the first reaction is quite large and intense, and the opposite reaction that the person feels in terms of the underlying theoretical processes, the A and the B, would probably look something like this, pretty small. And so the combined A and B together would be how we feel, our feelings. We can see that it's going to be primarily, that really positive excitement type reaction, because there's a lot of A and very little of the B shown in red. And so if I do A minus B, we end up with something kind of like that. And so in yellow, it's how we feel. And in green, I'm showing the A process. In red, I'm showing the B process. And in our case, the A process, or the A reaction, is feelings of maybe excitement. And maybe the B could be sadness, as an example. And so this would sort of represent how you might feel early in a relationship. You kiss someone, there's a huge amount of excitement and maybe a little bit of sadness when you have to be apart. So, it's sort of like early in that relationship that you're really driven by that primary feeling. Just like the first time a person was skydiving, they were primarily feeling the terror and the fear. But we know that this is going to change with repeated experiences. So now let's take a look at what the feelings in a relationship might be like after many years together. You're over that initial excitement that we saw in the first or second kiss. Now, how would this change over time? So the A process is going to remain the same, so I left it up there in green. The B process, though, gets bigger, doesn't it? So I'm going to make a much bigger B, and we're going to see that the B process is going to grow quite a bit. That, again, minimizes the emotional roller coaster experiences. So when we first meet someone, there is a huge amount of excitement and there is a lot of this emotional roller coaster. But hopefully with time, the relationship gets maybe less exciting, but also less volatile. And so there's just more of a mellow, even-keeled set of emotions that a person might experience. And then if we look at what they feel then, it's much less dramatic than on the first experience. So we can see that that definitely gets minimized and reduced. So you can see the power of the B process to lower our feelings, to sort of reduce the intensity of our feelings. It's no longer a really strong, really, really powerful excitement. It's a much more mellow feeling. But I do also want to point out what happens after there's been some kind of long-term relationship if it ends all of a sudden. We can see that the B process here has definitely grown over time. That's why you can imagine that after a relationship ends, the feelings are, again, very, very intense. But now it's the sadness. And indeed, the sadness we would feel is probably much greater at the end of a 10-year relationship than it would be after a 1-week relationship. Even though, ironically, we were probably more excited during the 1 week that we had in an early part of a relationship than maybe the last week of 10 years together. But if that relationship ends all of a sudden, the sadness could be very, very strong. All of a sudden you remove that person that you've been in love with for many years, and we're only left with that opposite feeling, the sadness that I've highlighted here in blue.